Hello, and welcome to Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, and we'll explore the fascinating stories of the city of Mississauga together. Thank you for your question. And yes, there are two buildings there on the either side of Cook Street, on the north side of Dundas Street. And the first one you're asking about, the address 51 Dundas Street West, was the former Schiller store, and it was built in 1913. David Schiller, who was a grandson of an early settler, Johann Schiller, he built a frame that's a wooden flower and seed store here in 1877. That's not the building that survives today, but it was on the same location. As his business flourished, he expanded the store, enlarged it, and he built a house behind the store in 1891. And that 1891 house actually still survives, but kind of tucked within the existing store you see today. David's sons, Thomas and James, joined their father in business in 1913, and the present building was completed as an expansion or an enlargement of the commercial presence of the building. And so that's the brick building you see today, built in 1913, with which is attached to the 1891 house at the back. Thomas David Schiller, T.D. Schiller, took over the family business in 1915 and expanded his inventory to include fertilizer, paint, roofing supplies, shoes, made-to-measure suits, and automobiles. Quite a collection of material at that entity. And right across the street from the old Schiller store is what is known as the former Cooksville Post Office and Shaver House, which were built in 1914, only a year after the Schiller store had been built. At this location, this is at the northeast corner of Cook and Dundas Street, in 1839 a post office was opened here under J.H. Savigny. And he was listed as the first postmaster. And that is when Cooksville officially got its name. That's 1839. Savigny was followed by Frank Morley, who in turn in 1871 was succeeded by John Peaker. And John Peaker built a new post office building, a wooden one, on the same location. And we have a historic picture of the Peaker post office. Peaker was succeeded by Herbert Shaver in 1898, and it was Herbert Shaver who built the present building on the same side of the original post office buildings. He built the present building in 1914, and the small addition to the side with the rounded cornice on it served as a post office, as the post office and the tinsmith shop. The building was later converted into a doctor's office, and of course it survives today. So those are the two buildings that really anchor Cooksville, historic Cooksville, on the modern landscape. Again, on the north side of Dundas Street, on either side of Cook Street. So thank you for your question. Thank you for your question, Jeff, on the old Dixie Theater, Dixie Cinema as it was known. Its official name was the Dixie 5 Theater. Again, although some refer to it as the Dixie Cinema, it was located at 1185 Dundas Street East. And the building, which survives today, is known as the Dixie 5 Pharmacy. And again, the building is still there today. The theater opened, at least according to early advertisement, in 1971, and it closed in 1984 or 1985. Unfortunately, we have very little additional information on the theater, but again, we invite anyone who might know more about the history of the theater. If you have pictures of it, please contact us and share them, looking for stories around the Dixie 5 Cinema, or the Dixie 5 Theater. Similarly, just down the road from that, we're always trying to find pictures of the old Roxy Theater in Cooksville. The Roxy opened in 1951 and had a massive seating capacity for the time of 500 people. It is a Quonset style or rounded style building, and the first movie to be shown was called Call Me Mister. And in 1956, only 5 years after opening, the Roxy Theater was purchased by Odeon Theaters Limited and renamed the Odeon Theater Cooksville, although locals still refer to it, and still do refer to it, as the Roxy. The property was sold to Chaingate Developments, and the theater was closed and demolished in 1971. And again, unfortunately, we do not have any pictures of it. We're always looking for pictures of the old Roxy Theatre. So please, if you have any of the Roxy or if you have any of the Dixie 5, please do let us know. The Roxy Theatre in Cooksville was located near to where the Orchard Family Restaurant is today, just south of Dundas Street and on the west side of here, Ontario. So again, Jeff, thank you for your question. Thank you, Carter, for your question. And yes, indeed, the Indigenous Mississaugas did suffer from diseases and epidemics, often brought on by perhaps unknowingly and unwillingly by incoming settlers. Not always. Although malaria was something that was rampant at times in the early years, and was brought. Malaria was known as the ague or swamp fever, brought on through infected mosquitoes. But others like smallpox, which was particularly devastating. Later, measles, diphtheria, and cholera also struck the Mississaugas of the Credit River and other Indigenous peoples as well. Many of these diseases they had no natural immunity to, and so those coming from elsewhere and abroad often brought disease with them, and the Mississaugas suffered as a result. Others, consumption, which we know today as tuberculosis, and again, diphtheria was rampant in the 1840s and 1850s and claimed a number of people, but smallpox was probably the deadliest in terms of mortality rate in those early years prior to the Mississauga's relocation of 1847. It's estimated that about half the population of the Mississaugas succumbed to one disease or another between the 1790s and the 1840s. So yes, disease was sadly prevalent and quite documented, quite well documented at a time. There were doctors that treated the Mississaugas and wrote about them. Donald Smith's book on Reverend Peter Jones and Sacred Feathers talks a great deal about these trials of the Mississaugas as they dealt with European diseases and the challenges it presented to the community and some of the disruptions sudden loss of life caused, particularly amongst the community leaders of the time. So yes, very much disease played an important role in the story of the Mississaugas, a sad and heartbreaking role at that, but were nonetheless a significant part of the story of the Mississaugas and the challenges they faced. So thank you, Carter, for your question. Thank you, Martine, for your question around historic buildings that the Mississaugas, the Indigenous Mississaugas, may have known. And the Indigenous Mississaugas lived along the banks of the Credit River until relocation in 1847, and we have a number of buildings that predate 1847 that survive here in the city of Mississauga. Probably the most direct one that we can connect to the story of the Mississaugas is today known as the Mississauga Masonic Temple in Port Credit. The town plot of Port Credit was surveyed in 1835, and in 1838 it was determined that the growing village required its own church, then to be a Methodist church. And the first Methodist church was established somewhere between 1838 and 1845. It's certainly operating by 1845, but there's some suggestion that the building itself dated to 1838. So a little bit of vagueness in its early years. And what is recorded in the story of the church is that the Indigenous Mississaugas from the Credit Mission assisted in the construction of the building, specifically with the hauling of foundation stones, shale, that is flat stones from the Credit River, to the building site to create the foundation for the new church building. The Indigenous Mississaugas were also represented on the first trustees of the church. There were 5 trustees of the new church building in 1845. 3 of them were Indigenous Mississaugas, and 2 of them were residents of Port Credit. And so, yes, the Indigenous Mississaugas are very much connected to this early church building. In 1845, only a few years before the Mississaugas relocated, they donated a chancel railing from the chapel to the Credit Mission Church to the new church in Port Credit. In 1893, in Port Credit, this is after the Mississaugas have relocated, a decision in Port Credit was made to build a larger church. And with the creation of the new church in 1894, the original church, the one that the Mississaugas helped to build, was sold and moved nearby to become a community hall known as Shaw's Hall. In 1915, Shaw's Hall was sold and it became the first Masonic lodge, today known as the Mississauga Masonic Temple. And it was put onto a new foundation and enlarged slightly to the building that we see today. And again, a remarkable part of our heritage today that survives, that has these roots that date back to around 1838 to 1845, and still very much with us today. So when we look at the connections to the Mississaugas and that early church building, it's the former First Methodist Church, now the site of the Mississauga Masonic Temple. Other buildings that have references to Indigenous Mississauga interaction include the Cherry Hill House. Cherry Hill House was once a private home. It was built between 1817 and 1821, and early settlers Jane and Joseph Silverthorne passed down stories of being visited by Indigenous peoples in their home. And there are other stories as well of interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples here in the city of Mississauga. There are other buildings as well. We have many buildings within our city that predate the 1847 relocation of the Mississaugas to the New Credit Reserve south of Brantford, Ontario. But those are probably the two strongest story connections that we have to one, the Mississauga Masonic Temple, and to the Cherry Hill House in Dixie. But again, there are others. So Martine, thank you for your question. Thank you for spending some time with us here at Ask a Historian. And please, we invite you to send in your questions and we'll explore the fascinating stories and the history of the city of Mississauga together. We look forward to seeing you each and every week here at Ask a Historian.